on the big screen, so everyone's going to be able to see super well. All right. We're still waiting to see if we can get sound online. How many of you have been to Fredericksburg Battlefield and seen Pelham's Corner, preserved by Central Virginia Battlefield Trust? Lots of hands up. That's fantastic. That's wonderful to see. There's some groups that I chat with, and they are all adding it to their list that they need to go and visit. All right. Let's see if I get a thumbs up. All right, fantastic. We'll just hold the microphones and let's get started. So tonight we're talking about a young Confederate artillery officer named John Pelham. We're going to focus in on his West Point years and his decision to join the Confederacy. So a very personal secession decision that we have here. Here is the image of the man that we're talking about. The photograph is pre-war era. As far as we know, there aren't any Civil War years photographs of John Pelham, so we're stuck with one from the very late 1850s. But John Pelham is associated with artillery, specifically the Stuart Horse Artillery. So he's with Jeb Stuart's Confederate cavalry, bringing mobile artillery power to the campaigns and battlefields. 1862 is kind of Pelham's year. He's going to have big moments on the peninsula during the Peninsula Campaign. He'll fight at 2nd Manassas, Antietam. The Loudoun County Campaign is a hallmark of horse artillery tactics, and then a big moment ends the year for him at the Battle of Fredericksburg. John Pelham dies mortally wounded at the Battle of Kelly's Ford in March 1863, and he dies when the Confederate cavalry legends are at their height. So in the historical record, Pelham dies undefeated, and it's that transition of life into memory. John Pelham is 24 years old when he dies. So he only has 24 years of life, and 5 of those years would be spent at the United States Military Academy at West Point. The majority of surviving letters that John Pelham wrote are from the West Point years. His war years letters were unfortunately lost in the early 20th century. So when we're looking through the historical record that survives, primary sources that Pelham himself wrote, we kind of have to look back to West Point letters and get a sense of his voice. And it's in the West Point years that we see Pelham making that transition from boy to man. And it's in the West Point years that he will make the largest decision of his life. So I always like to give a quick overview of where we're going with tonight's program. You can think of it as the orders of battle, if you will. For tonight, we're going to talk about John Pelham before the Civil War and how that helps us better understand the actions that he'll take during the Civil War years and his rise to command of the Stuart Horse Artillery. We're going to look at his early life. He grows up in Alabama, how he enters West Point, his West Point experiences. We'll pull from his writings from the West Point years. We'll talk about secession at West Point, and then we'll wrap up by talking in depth about Pelham's choice. So John Pelham's experiences, as we're going to focus on them tonight, see them as a groundwork for understanding his life. But also, I want to offer the idea that some of the things we're going to talk about tonight may be helpful for starting points when we're looking at the lives or secession decisions of other young Civil War officers. So you may be able to take some of these ideas into your own interests, research, and studying. So, growing up in Alabama, it's super helpful to know what part of the country we're talking about, what part of the state. So I bring you Google Maps with a pin dropped to the town, to the region. So it's up in the northeastern quadrant of the state of Alabama. I think it's about 3-hour drive from Atlanta. Made that drive at one point in my research. So John Pelham is born on September 7th, 1838. He is the third son of Dr. Atkinson Pelham and his wife, Martha Pelham. There'll be 4 more children after John Pelham, and a total in the family will be 6 boys and 1 girl. So Pelham's got lots of company for his escapades as they're running around the Cane Creek area of Alabama. His father, Dr. Atkinson Pelham, was a graduate of Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and then he's going to be moving the family from North Carolina to what at the time was frontier land of Alabama, recently opened up after Native American tribes had been forced moved to the West. Alabama is that frontier in the 1830s and early 1840s of the rising cotton economy in the South. You're going to find the Pelham family in Bentonville County, which will later change its name to Calhoun County, a nod to the fire eater over in South Carolina as the years in politics roll on. The Pelham family doesn't have a plantation in the Gone with the Wind sort of sense. They have multiple farms where land is being cleared, cotton and other crops are being planted. We do know that there were a number of enslaved people. Those are in the census records listed with the Pelham family. And John Pelham was known as one of the wild Pelham boys. The neighbors were convinced, and they wrote this down, that one of those Pelham boys is going to hang. So they would cause all kinds of trouble. They broke up the school when they didn't like the teacher. They were riding cows until the farmer said, you got to stop riding the cows. So the boys said, okay, fine. How about if we ride the bull? And apparently they gentled the bull so that it could be ridden. I can report from the historical records that none of the Pelham boys were hanged, but they did have quite a number of opinions and exciting lives as the years rolled on. This is an image taken along the Cane Creek area. Not far from where the site of John Pelham's birth was. So what you're seeing now is actually a modern golf course area. But I was watching a beautiful sunset in the area not far from where the sign is saying that John Pelham was born nearby. But it's going to be sort of these frontier farming scenes that Pelham is part of. Around age 16, he's going to be given charge of one of his father's properties. In the records, it says, quote, John directed all the work, managed the whole business without assistance, made a crop, cleared and fenced the whole place. So these older Pelham boys, they'd be sent off to one of the father's farms, usually with a couple of enslaved men, and they would have to clear the land and make a crop. And so this is Pelham's early life experience. And he writes a letter that survives, and he writes it in poetry. Now, it's not necessarily poetry that's going to make it into the literature books alongside Shakespeare, but it gives us a sense of his creativity. And it also gives us a really good glimpse of his life in this agricultural setting around the age of 16. So on February 27th, 1856, so this is the year he will end up going to West Point, so he may be a little older than 16. But he writes to his brother Charles, I am lonesome, and to pass off the time, I shall endeavor to write you in rhyme. Methinks there could not be very great harm to give you a description of my farm. It is stretched upon a very poor hill. This is very well known to you and brother Will. It is not exceedingly clean and neat, for part is spread with grass and part with wheat. If soon in May our cotton will appear, concerning a large crop you need not fear. But if not until May is almost out, concerning the crop you may greatly doubt. With a good season, our corn will yield more than was ever before seen in that field. We will make corn half as long as your arm, the largest that was ever before made on this farm. We will raise oats half as high as your head, sufficient, I think, to fill the oat shed. Then you will rejoice when you come home, if you but o'er these pretty fields roam. I have told you about my plantation. Now I will give you my situation. The house in which I live is very cold. For in this house there is many a hole. The chimney is made of rock, the hearth of dirt. But this, you know, us farmers cannot hurt. My room is furnished with table, desk, and bed, and opposite the fire I lay my head. Also with cupboard, chairs, and water stand, but these, you may know, are not very grand. The only company I have with me is Thomas and my well-known dog, Thea. We also have 2 very ugly cats, but they live on stealing and not on rats. At night, I have Tom without any hire. Tom is an enslaved servant, to have ready for me a blazing fire. I read before breakfast, and then at night, I take 1 hour to read and 1 to write. This week, I've been plowing with a young mule. To be brief, she is much a fool. The grass in the field is most 2 feet high, and the roots enough to make me cry. Emphasis original. The mule I plow is exceedingly rude, and often on my rest she will intrude. I'm commenced Peter a little plow stock, making one for his little brother, but heavy enough to give him a shock. Peter and Sam, these are younger brothers, have joined their crops against mine, but finally they will come out behind. I fear not what they against me can do, but I'll make the best crop, I warrant you. Thank you much for your good instruction. In the fault, there'll be a great reduction. I know it was habited board by me, from which I think I shall soon be free. You must not laugh at this foolish letter. I hope I write much better. He goes on and he leaves the poetry behind and goes into prose. And he talks about breaking a mule, training a mule, and then the challenge of seeing how this mule is pulling, how it's working in the field. And it was really interesting when I came across this letter and this poem, because it breaks away from that idea that Pelham grew up, in a fancy house away from hard work, and thinking about what would be required of him when he's commanding horse artillery, which is going to be everyone is mounted, horses or mules are pulling those cannons really fast, and we see examples of him having to pick horses and mules, having to figure out how to put these teams together. So thinking back to his agricultural youth, he's picking up some skills that will be helpful. As he goes on to the end of his letter, he says, at night, I have been drawing off some algebra problems, also writing down some speeches and compositions which I wish to preserve. And with this letter being written in 1856, it's looking forward, looking ahead, to going to West Point, which will happen later on in that year. Here's an image of John Pelham, probably about 1856 or so, just on his eve of going to West Point. You can see he's got some very fashionable hairdo going on there, little mohawk in the front. Actually, it does seem to be a hairstyle that's popular among older teen boys in this time. How's the sound? I don't know if there's a lot of reverberation coming for you guys. Is it okay? Or it's good? Okay, sounds good. I will keep going, but let's give this. How's this? Better? All right. We're going to do that.
We're going to try to get a
Maybe. All right. 1 second. Turn this off so it'll stop making noise. Okay. All right, let's do this. I enjoy leading battlefield tours, so we'll just go to battlefield voice. Is it okay in the back for you guys? Fantastic. All right, so when we're thinking about John Pelham and why does he not stay in an agricultural life? Are we okay on yours? All right, fantastic. We see that Dr. Atkinson Pelham, his father, is trying to make sure that his sons are set up in strong professions. There's also some hints when we're looking at the county records and some of Dr. Atkinson Pelham's letters that these farms are not economically productive for the family. So he wants his sons to be set up in more established professions. So you're going to see the older boys being trained to go into law, to go into medicine. Then we get to third son, and there's some hints in the family papers that money might be starting to run a little low. They're having some problems on the farms. And it is, while there would still be expenses with a son at West Point,
there is a guaranteed career, at least from the perspective of about 1855, into the United States Army, and there's going to be minimal expense for a son's solid education at West Point. So we do see that the Pelhams had a lot of connections in state government. They have connections at the county level, at the state level. And they're going to leverage those connections to help John Pelham get an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. A.J. Walker, who will become a name in the Alabama Confederacy, and also Jefferson Davis are involved in Pelham's appointment to West Point. Jefferson Davis is Secretary of War at the time, and he will sign Pelham's appointment to West Point.
Excuse me,
Yes.
can you do a quick intermission?
Sure.
Why don't you put this on and you can flip it to your.
I'm good. I'm going to
Sure?
do, yeah, I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate it, though.
Okay.
All right. So the appointment to West Point comes through when Pelham is 17 years old. So he is under the age of majority, which is 21 in that time. So his father actually has to sign the paperwork allowing him to enter the military academy. So Atkinson Pelham signs the paperwork. Atkinson Pelham also gives his son the physical exam, signs off on the paperwork there, and Pelham is going to be off to West Point. He will arrive there in June of 1856. He travels through Kentucky, seeing some family along the way. His mother wrote on June 15th, "We had a letter from John. He reached W. Point, seemed well pleased." According to the Academy's records, his formal entrance was on July 1st, 1856. And in this era, cadets arrive and then they're going to enter officially when West Point does their records. It's a little different than the way academies are now, where everybody reports on one day. You kind of have cadets showing up over the summer. They have to be there by a certain day to go into their first encampment, but it's not quite the same as we see in the military academies of this era. And it's there along the Hudson River at a historic point whose history goes back to the Revolutionary War, goes back into the early Republic, and the idea of having a school of the soldier along the Hudson River, nearly 1,000 miles from Calhoun County, Alabama, that John Pelham is going to step into a new life and a new world. We don't have written records of what he thought upon first seeing West Point, other than according to his mother, he seemed well pleased. But we do get an idea from a cadet who was there at the same time, Morris Schaeff, about what it was like arriving. And most cadets arrived via the Hudson River. Schaeff describes it this way: "The boat sped on, and I heard a passenger nearby observe, 'There is West Point.' My heart beat, and at once I caught the flag crimsoning in the distance. It needs but this bit of color, the proud banner lifting and swirling out gracefully and sinking back tenderly to the mast, to blend the scene with the thrill of heroic associations. Soon we were at the dock. Soon we were ascending the slope. The road from the wharf bears up the face of a precipitous bluff with a commanding view. Approaching the summit, the road, swings sharply to the left, around massively shouldered, lichened rocks, overshadowed by native forest trees. Then turns right, flanked by a heavy wall, and emerges near the library, upon the plain, 160 feet or so above the river. The plain, which is the counterpart of the campus at universities and colleges, is as level as a floor and has an area of 40-odd acres. Stepping into this scene, this will be where John Pelham spends the majority of the next 5 years. Now, it's 5 years, not because he was held back a class, but because the Secretary of War at the time, Jefferson Davis, future president of the Confederacy, thought it was a great idea to extend the academic years at West Point from 4 to 5. I will let you guess how popular that was with the cadets. Not popular at all. Pelham is one of the lucky or unlucky ones. He is in the class of 1861, Going in 1856, he's going to have 5 years of experience. Now, with hindsight, we know that there's actually 2 classes of 1861. There's the class of May 1861, which would be those guys who've been there for 5 years and where Pelham would have been if he stayed, spoiler alert. And then there will be the class of June 1861, cadets who've been there 4 years. But by June 1861, there's a civil war happening, and they are anxious to have these young men commissioned and go into military service. So we have class of May 61, class of June 61. On July 19th, 1856, John Pelham signs his enlistment oath. And it says, "I, John Pelham, of the state of Alabama, age 17 years, 9 months, having been selected for an appointment as cadet in the Military Academy of the United States, do hereby engage with the consent of my father, in the event of my receiving such an appointment," which he has, "that I will serve in the Army of the United States for 8 years, unless sooner discharged by competent authority. And I, John Pelham, do solemnly swear that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the United States of America, and that I will serve them honestly and faithfully against all their enemies or oppressors whatsoever, and observe and obey the orders of the President of the United States and the orders of the officers appointed over me according to the rules and articles of war." And this agreement, this oath, was later sworn and subscribed to at West Point, New York, and the official signing of it in front of the clerk of Orange County, that was done in January 1857. And at that point, it is seen in that era as a legally binding document. So having formally entered West Point, signed, and will have this legally agreed to, Pelham is going to start off with a summer encampment in his plebe year. So the encampments would be where new cadets are schooled by the upperclassmen, learning how to march, learning how to wear that uniform properly, getting used to this idea of a military school. At military academies in this era, and also in our modern era, they sort of count them back, they count their years backwards, if you will. So although this is the first time Pelham is at West Point, we say he's in his 5th year, or his plebe year. And we'll go, it'll count, so counting down to year 1, then he's getting ready to graduate and commission. So his 5th year, he is focusing academically primarily on mathematics and English studies. And we begin to see the report cards. He's in the lower third of his class with his grades. And this is going to continue throughout his time at West Point. He will even admit in his letters that academics are a bit of a struggle for him. In his first year at West Point, his 5th year or 5th class year, he would receive 70 demerits. This is an era in West Point's history where hazing is not known for its severity, although there were plenty of pranks and jokes played upon the cadets. One of them that is noted in the records is that Pelham was taken to a mock trial held by other cadets, and he was tried for reading his Bible instead of a military manual. Moving on to the 4th year, which would be 1857 to 1858. We don't have a lot of information about Pelham in the first 2 years that he's at the academy. We do know that when this academic year ended in June 1858, he stood 35th in mathematics, 39th in English studies, and 33rd in French. And he's in a class of 52 members at that time. He increased his demerit score. He's up to 92. Let's talk about some of the classmates, some of the names who are at West Point at the same time as Pelham. You can see on the screen some images, photographs of young cadets who are there at the same time as Pelham. So in the class of May 1861, which is Pelham's class, there will be names like Adelbert Ames, Orville Babcock, Samuel Benjamin, Charles E. Cross, Justin Dimmock, his photo is on the far right of the screen, Henry A. DuPont, Charles Hazlitt, Matthias Henry, Hugh Kilpatrick, and Emery Upton. Some names you might recognize from Civil War battlefields and orders of battle. Some other names that would cross paths with Pelham at West Point would be Edward Porter Alexander, famous artillerist for the Confederacy. He's class of 1857. Stephen Dodson Ramseur, class of 1858. Wesley Merritt, future Union Cavalry commander, class of 1858. Alonzo Cushing, class of June 61, as well as Patrick O'Rourke, June 61, and George Armstrong Custer, June 1861. At age 96, Adelbert Ames was interviewed and remembered this about John Pelham. He was easily the most popular man of the Corps in my time. Everybody liked him. I never heard anyone say a word against him. He was that kind of man, the kind of man whom you felt instinctively, here is a friend. Not that he was the sort to put himself forward to claim attention. No, he was quiet, simple, unassuming, unpretentious. There was a reserve about him that we got to know covered an inward strength. I came to know him better than the other boys from the South because in the 3rd or 4th class, I've forgotten which, when quarters were being reassigned, he lived in my room for 2 weeks. I got close to Pelham, you see, and I knew the man. There was something about him that drew you to him. I suppose nowadays it would be called personality. For most of his years at West Point, Pelham's was Thomas, future Confederate cavalry commander, and in records from both Pelham's family and Rosser's family, they were described as best friends. In 1858, Pelham gets a furlough. This will be the first time he will have been home since 1856. About halfway through the academic years at a military academy, the cadets would be allowed to go home for a summer. So that summer, they're not in charge of running an encampment or doing extra intensive learning. They get to go home and see their families. And in March 1858, he writes to his father saying, I need you to send permission to West Point, saying that I can leave for my furlough and come home. He's still not old enough to make that decision for himself. And he's asking for travel arrangements. You know, I might need some money for the train ticket, things like that. The family begins to get excited. Pelham's mother writes in a letter, she's anticipating having all her children back home that summer. They're all coming back from the different schools or places and professions where they're at. And she says, I am making arrangements for a watermelon patch for you. I am raising chickens for all you children when you come home this summer. She would write that she could hardly wait, quote, looking ahead to the pleasure of seeing you boys all together this summer. Pelham has 10 weeks of leave. It is possible that this photograph is taken as he passes through New York, headed out on his furlough. And he goes back to Alabama, settles into rural routines, enjoying teaching his young sister how to ride horses, interested in the farm setting again. He's also very interested in neighbor girls. There may have been a summer fling when Pelham is home, because when he makes his way back to West Point, he's going to write a very interesting letter to one of his brothers. And here is the entertaining quote for you. But remember, the best weapon for conquering women is flattery. Don't talk to them about history or grammar or the philosophy of Socrates, Plato, or Zeno, but tell them about the moon, spoons, the starry heavens, moonlight walks, and flatter them, and be certain then to let all your words be sentimental. I would like to be back in Alabama again, although I'm almost a follower of Machiavelli. How and where are Mrs. Henrietta Bush and last but not least of all, Miss Addie? If she was sincere in what she said, but I don't believe she was, I have wronged her in telling her such lies. I respected her, liked her company, but to love a lady is not in my composition now. I may outgrow my prejudices, and my heart may become susceptible to the impressions of woman's wiles, woman's smiles, and woman's blandishments. He's quoting something. I would like so much to spend a few more short days in Calhoun County. Furlough seems like a pleasant dream in which every action, word, and thought is vividly stamped upon the mind, but thanks to the presiding deity of the heart, it has made no impression there. But that pleasant dream is past. I now stand face to face with the stern realities of life. And those stern realities of life would be Pelham's what West Point calls third year there, which is 1858 to 1859. And here we begin to get more letters. The family is very worried about his grades. And when he has to tell what happened in the end, he wrote, quote, I came out lower than I expected, but I hope not lower than I deserved. And am not ashamed of it. 42 in philosophy, 46 in drawing and painting, 33 in Spanish, end quote. In February 1859, Pelham's writing to a younger brother. This younger brother's getting ready to go to school, and he writes, I do not think a man can be strictly honorable unless he is brave. If he fears and cringes to other men, he cannot fill the full definition of a man. When you leave home to enter college or other high schools, you will find it much more pleasant to yourself and at the same time command greater respect if you are not afraid of other scholars and that they cannot make you knuckle to them. But by all means, avoid being contentious and quarrelsome. It shows a want of true courage. It's a quote that gives us an idea, gives us a glimpse into the forming of Pelham's character in the West Point years, and it will reflect into how he interacts with men under his command when the Civil War comes. It's in his third year that Pelham says he's joining the Bachelor Club. He's not going to be dating or seeing any girls, he says, although he confesses to his mother that he likes to watch girls promenading around the walk with a telescope. I'm still undecided if that is funny or creepy. At the summer encampment of that year, Pelham is there, and it is called Camp Robert E. Lee, named for a former superintendent of West Point and someone who would complement Pelham on future battlefields. The image on the screen is not 1850s era. It's a little bit later, I believe 1870s, if I remember correctly, but it gives us an idea of what West Point scenes may have looked like. So I do think it's valuable in that way. In what West Point calls the second year, we find Pelham thinking ahead to his future and what that's going to look like for his military career, for his personal life, and he's communicating to his parents in letters that still exist. In December 1859, he tells his father that he thinks he'll stay single for 4 or 5 years after graduating, and then he offers criticism of officers who got married young. He says, quote, he does not expect to remain in the East very long. He could rough it on the frontier for several years and learn whether fate is propitious and in what direction fortune showers her favors. It's in the fall of 1859 that sectional conflicts are going to heat up. They will go up a notch with John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. And we see sectional divisions increasing at West Point. There's cadets from all parts of the country, all states, and they have strong opinions about abolition, about free soil, about upcoming elections. And we find Pelham in Company D of the Cadet Corps, and this company had a lot of other cadets from southern states. In October 1859, Morris Schaeff, a cadet there at the same time, wrote, quote, many of the Southern cadets broke out into natural and violent passion, denouncing in unmeasured terms the abolitionists and everyone in the North who shared their antipathy to slavery. But Adelbert Ames gives us a glimpse into Pelham's response, writing, in those days, on the eve of the Civil War, sectional feeling ran high at West Point as everywhere else. Cadets of the two sections were drawn more closely together. As a rule, political convictions were mutually respected, even to the same extent as a religious conviction. Issues were too grave to discuss, except in the most general and dispassionate way, if at all. No one's bearing under such circumstances was more wise, more discreet than John Pelham's. In January 1860, he writes his mother a descriptive letter about the riding hall. We have heads, rings, lances, and bars arranged around the hall, which we have to cut, thrust, parry, and jump, each one taking his turn. In his letters, we see that Pelham enjoys working with horses. He liked the exercises that he had to do for horsemanship, and he would take time to help other cadets who might be struggling with those skills. We know that he got hurt at least once in a riding accident that injured his knee and laid him up in the cadet hospital for a short time. He also enjoyed the physical activities of fencing and boxing. His roommate would note, you could see these were always fun for him. Out of the 50 cadets remaining in his class as the year comes to an end, he ranked 26th in ethics, 31st in infantry tactics, 31st in artillery tactics, 19th in cavalry tactics, 33rd in chemistry, and poor drawing, 40. The first year, as West Point calls it, the last year that Pelham will be at West Point, we find him taking a more active part in the social life at West Point. In August 1860, he becomes president of the Dialectic Society, and he writes that he was helping to host what he called the summer hops, which would be dances. This is a sketch that appears in Harper's Weekly right around 1860-61, so who knows? Maybe the artist saw John Pelham himself there in the scene. To his family, Pelham writes, I've almost changed my mind about entering the dragoons. I am now inclined to prefer the infantry. Now, whether that is a real preference or he's realizing he may not rank high enough in his class to be able to choose the dragoons and he's being pragmatic, it's a little hard to tell. But he's definitely thinking ahead to what his life looks like or what he anticipates it looking like when he leaves the academy. In autumn 1860, the Prince of Wales visited West Point, and Pelham wrote to his sister, I enjoyed the prince's visit vastly. They had a dress parade, and he comments on seeing Prince Edward of Great Britain during that visit. The 1860 election happens. Abraham Lincoln will be the presidential candidate who's won that election. And the southern states have a violent reaction and begin taking steps toward the secession that they have been threatening. By December 11th, Pelham writes to his mother, you may expect to see me at home by the 1st of February, 1861. I regret the circumstances which make it necessary, but I don't see any remedy. Alabama seems determined to leave the Union before the middle of January, and I think it would be dishonorable in me to withhold my services when they will be needed. It seems pretty hard that I should toil 4 years and a half for a diploma and then have to leave without it. I am studying pretty hard, and I think I will be higher after the coming January examination than I have ever been before. At the same time, he writes to his father saying, I don't see any honorable course other than tendering my resignation when Alabama leaves the Union and offering my services to her. In this, I have not acted precipitately, but in a manner worthy of myself, my family, and of my section of the country. Notice the word honor that keeps coming up. Pay attention to that word as we're looking at some of these writings. Pelham had already written to A.J. Walker, a judge in the Alabama Supreme Court, and he also wrote to Governor Moore of Alabama. Since he's representing Alabama at West Point, he is seeking advice from some of the highest political figures in his state as to what he should do in these extraordinary circumstances. As Pelham expected, Alabama declares secession on January 11th, 1861. The ordinance of Alabama's secession gives us a glimpse into the state's view of why they are seceding. The document declared that the Constitution of the United States of America was, quote, a compact, and that the, quote, state of Alabama now withdraws and is hereby withdrawn from the Union, known as the United States of America, and henceforth ceases to be one of the said United States, and is and of right ought to be a sovereign and independent state. End quote. They go on in this declaration to list their reasons for this action. And the reasons are listed as the election of Abraham Lincoln, quote, by a sectional party avowedly hostile to the domestic institutions of the state of Alabama and the dangerous infractions of the United States Constitution, which threaten the peace and security of the state, end sections of quotes. So having declared herself out of the Union, Alabama then goes on to proclaim that she will meet with other slaveholding states of the South in a meeting that would take place at Montgomery, Alabama, quote, for the purpose of consulting with each other as to the most effectual mode of securing concerted and harmonious action in whatever measures may be deemed most desirable for our common peace and security. So this is high level state of Alabama, their ordinance of secession. Stumbling over some words here. So let's bring it down to a personal level. What does John Pelham know? What is John Pelham thinking about? What contextually is his mindset as he's approaching this decision of his life? To look at the mindset, we're looking at his letters, and we can also look at family documents as well. John Pelham's older brother, Charles Pelham, wrote this: "We boys are all secessionists, but Pa, their father, is very conservative. We call him submissionist." So do we have some civil war going on within the Pelham family? Now, older brother Charles Pelham made no secret that he saw slavery being at the root of the Civil War conflict. In fact, in one letter, he bragged about hanging an abolitionist without judge or jury, and also noted in the same letter that several African Americans were hanged at the same time. Now, I want to be clear, this happens while John Pelham is at West Point. He's not involved with that. He seems to have been more mild-mannered than his older brother, but think about what it tells us about the mindset that he's grown up with, a background that John Pelham would be familiar with. But here's another thing to think about. Pelham has lived in the North for almost 5 years. Now, he's at a military academy, but he is in New York State. He knows Northerners. He knows abolitionists. We know this from who we see him interacting with in the Cadet Corps. But it goes a little bit further. Pelham has an aunt, Martha Pelham Mott, who is an abolitionist. He's interacted with her. He corresponds with his cousins in that family and may have seen them on short leaves from West Point. He's friends with Albert Ames and Henry DuPont, who both hold a strong and permanent Union interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. So people around Pelham offer different views beyond a strong states' rights opinion and the pro-slavery society he had grown up with, and which his brothers seem to have strongly supported. So this gives us another glimpse into Pelham's choice. He's not going to fall blindly into the ranks of the Confederacy. There are alternate views. There are other opinions around him. Now, it's unsurprising that Pelham is not going to change his opinions. He's in a generation of young Southern men who've seen a shift, an us versus them mentality with abolitionists and expansionists of slavery. In the 1830s, there's a shift of thought. So this is then going to influence Pelham's generation, where racial slavery, it's shifted from being seen as sort of that necessary evil, think the Founding Fathers era with that, to then this idea that it was, that slavery could be perpetual and the expansion of it could be seen as a good or even a righteous act. And tied up with all of that is the concept of state sovereignty. So Pelham's generation of young men heard arguments against the continuation of slavery. They saw this as an aggression from Northerners who want to curb the South's economic expansion into the West and the end of enslavement. And then this generation is going to take their elder statesman rhetoric to a new fiery level. Their generation sees that their culture and way of life was under threat. If radical abolitionists gain political power in Congress, secession and the invocation of state sovereignty above the Union to them was seen as a viable, legal, and even right option. And under this view, a state had more power than the federal government, and a man's allegiance went first to his state. So thinking about that context of Pelham's generation in the South, now we have to think about Pelham's oath and how that weighs on his mind. He signed a service oath that if he received an appointment to West Point, he would serve in the Army of the United States for 8 years, unless sooner discharged by competent authority. He'd promised to bear true faith and allegiance to the United States, to serve them faithfully, obey the orders of the president. But then there's different interpretations of that oath, just like you see different interpretations of the Constitution as the Civil War conflict rises. And so, like many other Southerners with a connection to the United States Army, Pelham has to make a choice. And while it would be unlikely for Pelham to choose a course other than the one he ultimately took, he had to make a decision in a way that he believed was honorable. He had to make a choice and make that choice right in his own mind, while others around him were offering a lot of concern, a lot of advice, and a lot of encouragement. And what we see when we look at the letters that Pelham's writing in the winter and spring of 1861 is immense pressure from friends around him at West Point, from his family, and then from people in his state who he's never even met, but who suddenly have a strong opinion about what he should or should not be doing. And what we see from these letters is Pelham's choice is not one that he took lightly. Remember, he's put in almost 5 years of work to get a diploma, to get a commission, to have a steady position and job for the future. On February 1st, 1861, Atkinson Pelham signed a document that reads, "In consequence of the troubled and unhappy condition of our country, I hereby give my son, John Pelham, a cadet at the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York, permission to tender his resignation to the superintendent or other proper officer of that institution." He now has that legal paper, his father's permission. He can leave. He can put in a resignation if he wants. But Pelham waits. He's still saying he wants to graduate, and he keeps writing to political leaders. He's trying to get advice. He writes to Jefferson Davis. As far as we know, Davis didn't write back. In February, March 1861, Davis has a lot more on his mind, stepping into a provisional president's role of this newly formed Confederacy. But it's interesting that Pelham's reaching out, trying to get advice for dealing with this situation. Henry DuPont, who will stay in the United States Army, wrote to his family in the spring of 1861, quote, "Rosser, Pelham, and Rives are still here and do not intend to resign unless they receive official notice of their having been appointed to a position in their state, and then they will hand in their resignations so as to enable them to accept the appointments as soon as they are released from their engagements to the United States. They are in hopes that no official communication will be sent to them, so they can remain and graduate, which they are naturally most anxious to do." Pelham was frustrated, and he begins to draw his personal line in the sand, if you will. He writes to his family, "I am not master of my own acts at present. I have been appointed a first lieutenant in the Army of the Confederate States of America. The appointment was made without my consent or knowledge. I cannot accept an appointment from them as long as I am a member of this institution. But if I am recalled by the authorities, I will obey it." So what's happened is the Confederacy has put John Pelham's name on a commission, and they've printed it in the newspapers. So now people are like, why isn't our cadet back? What is he doing? So now people who don't even know John Pelham have this opinion of what he should be doing. And Pelham is taking the stance of, if I get official correspondence, then I'll act. But I want to graduate. So he's stuck in the middle of this dilemma. And he keeps coming back. We see it in what DuPont writes, and we see it in Pelham's writing, that he has this belief that to take another commission while still in United States service would be dishonorable. We're coming back to that theme of honor and dishonor. He writes, quote, resisted every overture on the part of my friends to resign, disregarded their advice and anger. And then he shifts into sarcasm, I think, in his writing. I had no idea I was so well supplied with friends. All seem to vie with each other in attempting to force me to resign. And he tells his family that he's heard that people were cursing and abusing me awfully in Montgomery, capital of Alabama, new capital of the Confederacy. To his sister-in-law, Pelham writes, although I am a most ultra-secessionist, I am still proud of the American flag. I think that both sides ought, in justice to the illustrious dead, lay it aside as a memento of our past greatness and our revolutionary renown. I would fight harder and longer to bar the stars and stripes from every northern battlement than for any other cause. They have no right to use it, and we should not permit them. It should be stored away. Then he gives us a little humorous anecdote. He tells his sister-in-law he's taking a diplomatic step while he's at West Point. He's making sure that the girls who live in the area like him, so that if he gets imprisoned, they will come and visit him. He says it's not going well, quote, it's a sad blunder. On April 10th, they don't know it yet, but it's just days before the firing on Fort Sumter, Henry DuPont writes to his family. These are the final days before Pelham's choice will be enacted. DuPont writes, you do not know the position in which Rosser and Pelham are in. They are not in the service of the Southern Confederacy now, as they have not accepted appointments. In fact, they know nothing more about it than do you or I, only having seen them in the paper. Take Pelham, for instance, a man of nicer and more honorable feelings never lived. Some months ago, the governor of his state, Alabama, wrote to him offering him a high rank in the state forces if he would resign and come home. He would have nothing to do with it and did not even answer the letter and had not applied for any position in the Confederate troops. But like many others, they have appointed him a first lieutenant. That is, have published in the newspapers his appointment, there having been no application made for the place. He does not intend to serve in the Army, the U.S. Army, but will resign as soon as he graduates, which is quite right under the circumstances, as he cannot be expected to fight against his home and his friends. He will, though, as an honorable man, never accept a commission from the Confederate States until he has resigned the one he holds in that of the United States. He thought that, painful as it would be to give up his diploma after having undergone so much to obtain it and the many advantages which the possession gives, that, nevertheless, if he received an official notification that his services were solicited in the defense of his home, that it would be his duty to give up his own inclinations and interest and tender his resignation and go home and accept the position offered to him, and was very glad that they did not send him any official information consequently. What stands out to me is this is April 10th that Henry DuPont is writing this, and there's a theme. We've seen it in Pelham's letters. Now it seems like Pelham has probably had some long conversations with Henry DuPont, who's now writing this in a letter to his own family. So there's some consistency in what Pelham wants to do and what he is anticipating he'll do. And we see honor being that guiding force. Then Fort Sumter happens. Then there's a lot of scrutiny at Southerners who are still in the United States Army and the two Southern cadets still at West Point, John Pelham and Thomas Rosser. On April 15th, 3 days after the firing of Fort Sumter began, 1 day after Fort Sumter's surrender, April 15th, John Pelham fills out the official resignation form. And he sends it to the United States Secretary of War, Simon Cameron. It's a standard form, doesn't say anything about secession on it. It's the standard resigning from West Point form. But at the bottom of that form, in the blank space, John Pelham writes, and I quote, I have accepted no place or appointment from any other state or government, end quote. And there is the full circle of all this documentation in letters, and it gives us a clue into how he makes this decision and how he makes it honorable in his mind and in his thinking. An officer by the name of John F. Reynolds, who would fall in a Union uniform on the fields at Gettysburg, reviewed Pelham's resignation, signed, and forwarded it. West Point officially dated Pelham's resignation to April 22nd, 1861, but by that date, John Pelham was already gone. He leaves West Point in the night. He goes with Thomas Rosser, and they're going to head south, heading back to home states and to a future that is unknown, one that they have not planned for these last 5 years at West Point. To one classmate, Pelham would always be remembered as, quote, alive, walking across the area, end quote. But as he departed, the Alabamian begins to face the idea of his own mortality and the idea of war. When saying goodbye to a fellow cadet, Pelham reportedly said, "I am going home. I shall be in 2 or 3 fights and then be killed," end quote. Choices and actions could have deadly repercussions, and Pelham recognized that as he left the place of his military training and thought about his future. John Pelham's journey south took a circuitous route, an evasive route. He eventually arrives back in Alabama at the end of April 1861, and he did accept his commission into Confederate service in May. Then his orders send him to Virginia. Eventually, he'll make his way to Harper's Ferry, where he organized and drilled Albertus's battery, also sometimes referred to as Wise's artillery. Pelham's first combat experience took place on July 21st, 1861, at Bull Run, or First Manassas. And it's after that battle that he would discover that some of the cannons he had dueled across Henry House Hill had belonged to the West Point battery. When Pelham left West Point in April 1861, he had just less than 2 years left to live. But what he accomplished in those 23 months is what he is most remembered for in the history books. He organizes the Stuart Horse Artillery. He fights river gunboats with that artillery. He goes out and does flanking fire in important positions on battlefields. He covered retreats. He was known for engaging under desperate odds. He hones the idea of mobile artillery tactics. In horse artillery, that means everyone, your gunners, are mounted. Everyone can go as fast as those horses could go, or as fast as the horses pulling the cannons can go. And that is going to allow artillery to keep up with the cavalry, to wheel into positions and fire off shots rapidly, to go out into exposed flanking positions and lay down fire and then retreat rapidly before infantry can advance and capture those guns. Pelham hones this idea of mobile artillery tactics. He's certainly not the only officer commanding horse artillery. There are other Confederate units and certainly Union units as well, or Union batteries as well. Pelham will continue his rise to fame. He'll command artillery on battlefields for Stonewall Jackson. At 2nd Manassas in August 1862, Jackson gives Pelham free rein. Jackson gives Pelham free rein. You can go anywhere that's advantageous. Jackson controls everybody and their artillery. Pelham has risen in the trust of Stuart, of Jackson, and he'll come to the attention of Robert E. Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia. Pelham will be part of creating legends in advanced artillery positions. But it's the skills and the disciplines that Pelham learned in 5 years at West Point. They went with him as he made a personal choice for secession. And that training underpinned his Confederate successes on numerous battlefields and skirmish grounds. So I hope that this deeper look at Pelham's youth, at what we know and can piece together of his West Point years and that decision that he makes, I hope that lays a foundation, maybe gives insight to how you've seen his artillery used in battle studies. And if you are interested in a deeper dive on battles, I'm happy to take it as questions. We also have a newly released book called Glorious Courage, John Pelham in the Civil War. It just came out this year. It's part of the Emerging Civil War series, published with Savas Beatty, and it has multiple chapters going in depth on what Pelham does on battlefields. So I want to thank you for inviting me back, and I'm happy to take questions if time allows. Thank you. I'm seeing that we're good for questions. So yes, sir.
Out of curiosity, Sarah, when you talk about all these letters, some of them are really great, poetry and everything. Did you ever come across any of the originals, or was it mostly online stuff, or how did that work?
Right. So the letters that do exist, the question was, where are they? Are we looking at originals? There are originals. I got to see copies of the originals because they don't always let the originals, be out for research. But the ones that I was looking at are either copies held by the John Pelham Historical Association. There are also some letters held by the Alabama Archives, so seeing copies of those. So it was really interesting to get to see them. They're quoted in other biographies, but I wanted to go and make sure I was seeing everything there was to see that we know about. And I think from the West Point letters and from a letter that Pelham wrote, to his father immediately following his combat experience at First Manassas, it's a big hole in our understanding both of Pelham's life and the horse artillery and just a young officer's experience in the Civil War that we're missing those letters. So they might be out there. I had this idea that we'll publish the book and, next week there'll be a phone call. Hasn't happened yet, but maybe they're out there in a thrift store in an attic, and it would be really exciting if they would come to light. So, yes. Go ahead.
Sarah, thank you for this fabulous presentation. How did the rest of the Pelham brothers of that rowdy bunch come through the war?
Oh, great question. Repeating it for our online audience, how did the rest of the Pelham brothers fare in the war? They survive. Many of them do go into Confederate service, mostly Alabama units. One of them, I'm forgetting which one, he ends up at Fort Morgan for a short time. I think another is in, Alabama Cavalry. I should really do a blog post or something on that. But yes, the Pelham brothers would later give interviews talking about their brother John. There's a little bit of writing out there that they and their wives did, remembering him. So that kind of brings in like the way the family wants him to be remembered, the family lore. Some of those accounts that come from his youth are through the brothers' reminiscence as well. I think there's a question in the back. Yes.
I wanted to ask you if you might take a minute to talk about and what his role was there, where he was placed during the battle.
Absolutely. So the question was, where is Pelham at Fredericksburg? So if you're familiar with the Fredericksburg battlefield, or if you're picturing a battle map, you're going to find John Pelham at the far, think of it as the southern end of the Confederate line. So Jackson has a position on Prospect Hill, which is at the far end of the line from Marie's Heights. Marie's Heights, where the sunken road is, that's the other end of the line. But Prospect Hill, Slaughter Pen Farm, if those are landmarks that sound a little bit familiar, that's the end of the field that Pelham is on. So what's going to happen is the Confederates have a position up on Prospect Hill in this high ground overlooking open fields, and you have Union troops that are lining up. This will be First Corps getting ready to attack toward the Confederate line. There'll actually be a breakthrough in the infantry battle there later in the day. But it's in the early morning hours. There's ground fog laying over the land on December 13th, 1862. And Pelham asks permission. He asks Jeb Stuart if he can take a cannon out and position it on the flank or on the side of the Union line. So if I can use you as Union troops for just a second, imagine you're all facing the wall that way. So you'd be looking toward Prospect Hill. And if I can turn it into a battlefield, Pelham come out in an advanced position about a mile in front of the Union line. Union troops are all looking that way, and he's going to open fire down the flank, down the side, in what's called enfilading fire. And it's a big surprise. Early morning, fog, troops ready to go into battle, but the battle hasn't opened yet on the 13th. There's a Union soldier who will later write that he was very confused. He couldn't figure out why the Union gunners had had too much commissary that morning. He thinks there's a drunk Union gun that's doing friendly fire. But eventually they come to realize, oh, no, that's a Confederate gun. Pelham's out in this advanced position. He's taken a gun crew out there with him. There will be a second cannon, Confederate cannon, that tries to join Pelham, but it is destroyed and put out of action fairly quickly. Pelham will draw fire from multiple Union batteries. I just did, actually it's not published yet. It'll be coming out soon. Next week on the Emerging Civil War blog, but talking about these other Union batteries that are engaging Pelham's lone gun. And this is where Pelham's going to use horse artillery tactics to his advantage. He'll fire a shot, and then they're going to move and reposition that gun. So it's going to be hard for Union gunners to pinpoint exactly where Pelham and that cannon are. So he will be in this advanced position for maybe close to an hour. Accounts tend to vary a bit. Pelham says he's not going to leave until he runs out of ammunition. Interestingly, he, according to stories, runs out of ammunition coincidentally right about the time that Union infantry starts coming up toward him. So it's certainly a moment that is well documented. Has it taken on a life of its own in legend? A little bit, I think so. But it's this opening of the Battle of Fredericksburg, and the battle area was much more open at the time than it is now. So it's witnessed by a lot of Confederate officers, including Robert E. Lee from somewhere on the Confederate line. In his official report, Robert E. Lee will call Pelham gallant. He'll call this action gallant. So that's where you're going to hear Gallant Pelham becoming his nickname, becoming how he's identified. Lee will also reportedly say, "It is glorious to see courage in one so young." And it's pulling from that quote that we got the book title. So I hope that's a quick overview. Pelham's Corner is a small tract of preserved land. It's held by the Central Virginia Battlefields Trust. Their president actually wrote one of the appendixes in the book, and he talks about the details of preserving that area. But if you're in the Fredericksburg area, if you're visiting Slaughter Pen Farm, preserved by American Battlefield Trust, drive down the road a little bit and see where Pelham's gun position was. And then think of him moving around the area. We do have some descriptions of what that land looked like along the Bowling Green Road. So we can piece it together pretty well. And that's the vicinity he would have been in. Thank you for the question. I appreciate it. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I have two questions. What rank was he when he was killed? And was any attempt made to try to stop the Southerners from getting back home?
Great question. So let me answer the first one. What rank is Pelham when he's killed? So he is a major at the time of his mortal wounding and death. After his passing, he would then be promoted to lieutenant colonel. So he has a posthumous promotion there, but he's major. And interestingly, Stuart and other officers were advocating in the winter of 62-63 for Pelham to get a promotion, but it was moving very slowly through the red tape in Richmond. There's some frustrated letters coming from some cavalry generals wanting Pelham to promote, but it's not till after his death that he'll go to lieutenant colonel. And then the other question was, is anything being done to stop Southern cadets from leaving West Point? Yes, no, maybe. It kind of depends on circumstances. There are family stories that Pelham and Rosser may have been pursued, that Pelham may have pulled a subterfuge on some Union officers, or I guess they'd be U.S. soldiers, U.S. officers trying to follow him. But other cadets who had left previously, there doesn't seem to be much done in stopping them. So kind of depends, but Pelham and Rosser were the last of the Southern cadets expected that they might leave, and they are the last to leave. So thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Summary of the day he was killed.
Sure. A brief summary of the day he was killed. March 17th, 1863, Battle of Kelly's Ford. Union cavalry has crossed the Rappahannock River at Kelly's Ford, and they're pushing back Confederate cavalry commanded by Fitzhugh Lee. Lee's putting up a resistance. Union cavalry is also doing well. It's this moment where, oh, Union cavalry can fight Confederate cavalry. They're kind of having this epiphany moment, and their commander, Averill, is wanting that to happen, to build some confidence in his men. John Pelham had spent the night in Culpeper, Virginia. That's where his commanding officer, General Jeb Stuart, was as well. We're not entirely sure what's going on. Pelham had made this long journey. He loops through Orange, Virginia. According to some sources, he saw some friends there. He goes on to Culpeper, where he meets up with Stuart, who had been involved in sitting on a court-martial there. So he's rejoined Stuart. They're planning to go back toward Fredericksburg, where the main cavalry camps are. But then this fight breaks out at Kelly's Ford. So Stuart decides to ride out, see how Fitz Lee's handling the battle. Does he need any help? What's going on? Pelham goes out to observe as well. Pelham directs some cannons to go into position, but he's not commanding a battery at this fight. There's a variety of different accounts. I go into this a little bit in the book, trying to break down who said what about Pelham at the Battle of Kelly's Ford. Is really fun because the big exciting stories are written by people who weren't eyewitnesses and who might be trying to place Pelham in a cavalry charge, whether or not he actually was. What does seem clear, Pelham's on the battlefield. He at least helps to rally Confederate cavalry, get them excited about making a charge toward a Union position. And then when I was doing the research for this, I had a Venn diagram on a dry erase board in my apartment. And I was going through all these different accounts and trying to figure out what does everyone seem to agree upon? And there's a lot of confusion as to where Pelham was when he was wounded, what exactly he was doing. But the one thing that was in the center of that Venn diagram was everyone was saying Pelham fell backwards off his horse when he's wounded. What we do know is he's wounded by fragments of an artillery shell. So it's exploded above his head. Those metal fragments went into the back of his skull, and he falls backward off his horse. As far as we know, he never regains consciousness. So at that point, it's up to the people around him to try to get medical care for him. They start by putting him on a horse, laying his body over a horse, and he's taken very slowly down the road in that condition. Having lots of blood flow to the brain in that way when you already have some injury there is probably not helpful. We can't say that is what killed Pelham. We just don't know the full extent of his injuries. But he has this journey, and eventually he's put in an ambulance. He's taken to the village of Culpeper, to some mutual friends' home, the Shackelford home. There, doctors examine his injuries. He still appears to be unconscious. He does not seem to regain consciousness as day goes into afternoon, into evening and night. And it's a little bit after midnight in the early morning hours of March 18th, 1863, that according to Henry Gilmore, Pelham opened his eyes once and then he passed away. So that is the end of John Pelham's battlefield experiences, the end of his life, the end of his Civil War story where he is actively taking part in it. Pelham's journey into Civil War memory is going to begin as he falls off that horse, as he draws his last breath, and people are caring for him. He's going to have a massive funeral in Richmond, capital of the Confederacy. With hindsight, we can look back and almost see Pelham's funeral as a dress rehearsal for what Richmond will do a few weeks later for Stonewall Jackson. There's a lot of similarities, lying in state, processions, railroads being used. And then with escort, Pelham's remains would be sent to Alabama. He lies in state in the state capitol, and then his coffin is taken to his family's home. And there's a large church service held in Jacksonville, and then he's buried there. Later, decades later, a monument is put up at his grave. So there's a lot that happens in that moment. The Confederacy's in a moment where they have, if you will, time to mourn, time to have a young hero figure. And Pelham kind of tragically for him and for his family steps into that void. I think that's what helps sort of propel him into the high ranks of Confederate memory as the war goes on, and then as we go into post-war years as well. Yes.
Sarah, how was that decision made to have a kind of a state funeral for a relatively low-ranking officer in Richmond?
Right, it's a great question. Who's making the decision for this big funeral? Jeb Stuart is going to set the ball in motion, so to speak. Pelham has his own place in the Confederacy already, though. What happens at Fredericksburg capstones a successful and deadly to Union troops year of 1862 for Pelham on Virginia battlefields. So he's been recognized numerous times in official reports, in newspaper accounts. What happens at Fredericksburg makes Confederate Southern newspapers, it makes Northern newspapers, it even makes international news. There are accounts in British newspapers of Pelham's exploit at Fredericksburg. So he's stepped into the big stage. So his death at Kelly's Ford, a place where you kind of would not expect that to be where Pelham falls. It's almost like the accident battle for his perspective. He is recognized. He's a known name throughout the South. So I think that, and then Jeb Stuart saying, yes, big funeral, that's going to kind of set things in motion and seal his place into memory, if you will. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you have any breakdown of that May 61 graduating class? You said there was 50 in there. Did all the Southerners leave?
I would have to double check for you on that. You're going to have Southerners in across all of the classes that would be at West Point leaving. I would have to get a breakdown for you on that. My card's in the back. If you email, I'd be happy to double check and research it for you. So, any other questions? Yes. Oh, good question. All right, photograph on the screen. What is on the left? What Pelham's holding? Is that okay? Oop. I'm going to go back because that's the photo I want. All right, so here we don't have the photo cut off for the book cover. So he is holding a hat. It does appear to have some West Point insignia there on the front, as well as some cut of the jacket. And there's some things that definitely identify this as a West Point uniform. That's pretty generally accepted in historical studies of photographs and historical studies of Pelham. The big question is, when was it taken? So there's debate around that in researchers of Pelham, but it's definitely before the Civil War. There will be cartes de visite made off this photograph and then distributed throughout the Confederacy. So the original glass of this, it was held by the family for a while, or a family member. And then a few years ago, it was either given or sold, I don't remember which, to the Library of Congress. So it's now in their holdings. Good question. There's a lot to see in the photograph when you start zooming in and looking at the button details and his cravat and different things. So one of the opening parts of the book, I was actually trying to describe in words this photograph. I see one more question.
Just an observation. Knowing how the military works, he doesn't have any insignia on there showing his rank. I doubt that that's a military uniform.
That's possible, but my understanding.
Always has an insignia of some sort.
Yeah, I've heard from uniform experts that it is a West Point uniform of that era. Just probably not a dress West Point uniform, but there's always room for more research. So, any other questions before we wrap? All right, well, thank you again. It's lovely to be here.
On behalf of our roundtable, please accept it.
Thank you so much.
These awards by our members important. They're He
you.
is our famous artist.
Thank
This is at
you.
Fort Fisher, Sarah, and Sarah will visit there tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate you so much.
Thank you.
While you're ahead of class, do you mind pulling our raffle ticket?
Yes, of course.